The board minutes are one of the most important legal and communications tool a foundation has. How do you see them as a governance and management tool, Karen?
Well, definitely they are a great record of policy decisions, management decisions that the foundation makes. And so you know what the discussion was, why you made these decisions. From a legal side, what are examples of where it comes up in the legal context?
So I have a couple of stories. One involves a regulatory overview. It's an audit by the IRS and the state attorney general, who is the state regulator of charities. And in that case, we had a situation where the IRS and the state regulator was asking us to justify the compensation that directors and trustees were receiving in their role in managing and governing the foundation. And the first thing, of course, they asked for was the board minutes. And this foundation had very good board minutes that showed how the meetings they had and the actions that they were taking with respect to reviewing grant making, reviewing grantees, and their role in governing the organization. They could document all the things that they were doing.
So in other words, they didn't really have to create a justification. They really had it set in the minutes. These are the responsibilities that the trustees have. They're significant responsibilities, and that helped you justify the compensation when it came under question.
Exactly, and the board minutes show that they were in fact doing those things. They were making those decisions, and they were actively managing the organization. It wasn't just a job description, and we didn't know what in fact they were doing. The board minutes showed what they were doing. Mm-hmm. Another example is donor intent. Foundations often have questions about donor intent. What is a foundation's grant-making focus? And in this situation, we had very simple minutes that didn't really show and document donor intent. And we also had infighting and dispute among trustees and board members with respect to their roles on the board and in fact, who was meant to lead the foundation. And be the chair of the foundation, be the president of the foundation, be the external facing of the foundation. And none of that was recorded in board minutes or even had any discussions among board members in the board minutes. And there was a lot of dispute and fighting about that.
So was that a question of what direct family descendants and the involvement of spouses, or step family? What was the issue?
It was all of the above. Spouses, stepchildren, different board members and different family members having different relationships with the founder of the organization, of the foundation, over the history of the foundation, and a lot of changing of the roles over the years, and as happens, the founder of the organization passed away, and a lot of these ambiguities
were unresolved.
Exactly.
And I would say, Andras, that is like a bedrock governance issue. If there's one thing that I would counsel boards to discuss, the very first thing is who is family, and lay that out as a policy and lay out that discussion and the rationale for those decisions in the minutes as well as in policy. Because when governance is weak is when you get into legal issues. So that's where the sort of the minutes laying these things out, laying out the discussion, the rationale can be really key.
Exactly. So the legal overview of board minutes is very simple. As I said, it's the official and legal record of a board meeting. And keep in mind that they should also include committee meetings. So we want to have records of board meetings as well as committee meetings. They need to be accurate and complete of all the actions that are taken and the reasons for the actions. And we'll talk a little bit about that. They need to be simple, clear, and unambiguous. They don't have to be very detailed, but they need to be clearly interpreted and read by a third party to understand what happened at a board meeting. Keep in mind that board meetings, board minutes, and committee minutes can be used in legal proceedings. So if there's a lawsuit, again, if there's a regulatory audit, they can be used in legal proceedings. Their accuracy can be rebutted through other documentation, but they're the first types of legal documents.
In fact, in my own life, I worked for a foundation. I was the president of a foundation where one of our grantees threatened to bring suit, and the suit relied on information that was 30 years old, and only one woman was alive from those days. She was a trustee in her 90s. So we actually had to rely, to avoid this suit, on the thoroughness and the accuracy of what people's intent was in a specific decision around funding this particular grantee from 30 years ago. And I can't tell you how helpful it was to have those records. In the end, we were able to mediate and solve the dispute.
That's important, and it's important to know what should be included in the board minutes. So you need to have a date and time of the meeting, the beginning and end of the meeting. You want to record whether it's a special or regular meeting.
What's a special meeting mean?
The special meeting is typically a meeting that's in between a regular meeting. So you usually set quarterly meetings or monthly regular meetings or meetings twice a year. And you might have a special issue, a special grant that needs to be approved, or a particular transaction that needs to be approved outside of that regular meeting. That's when you call a special meeting.
Okay.
You want to record who is present, the directors who are present and absent, any guests and others who are present, for example, staff, auditors or legal counsel who may be present. You want to make sure that you record that there's a quorum established. So if you do take any decisions, that they're valid. Departures, the comings and goings at a board meeting, particular recusals.
Now, why would the comings and goings need to be noted?
Well, sometimes, depending on the transaction that's being approved, you might need to recuse somebody who has a conflict of interest with respect to a transaction. So, for example, if you're approving a grant and there's a conflicted board member, you want to not only show that they are recused from the discussion, so they might be asked to leave the room, but you might want to also show and need to show that they are recused from the voting.
And so they could be, a conflicted board member might be, for example, someone who serves on that nonprofit's board or volunteers there. And you want to indicate, they can be included in the discussion.
Yes.
But you want to indicate if they are or if they're not, and you certainly want to indicate whether they're voting or not.
Exactly.
Okay.
And oftentimes that will follow your conflict of interest policy as well, the
Right.
different procedures. And again, the heart of it is to record board actions and the rationale and the whys for why you're taking certain decisions. Discuss any alternatives if you've considered alternatives. And then the voting, how is the voting, and record any abstentions. There are a few key issues that we always get questions about, and one is, should we draft legal resolutions? So if you need to approve a self-dealing transaction, if you need to approve a particular transaction that has a particular legal significance for the foundation, it's always a good idea to run that by legal counsel first and make sure that the specific language is appropriate and everything that needs to be included is included. And you can circulate that, in fact, in advance of the board meeting.
To see if people have questions
Exactly.
before they even get there to discuss it.
Exactly. Yeah. Minutes don't have to be signed to be effective. That's always a question that we ask. Do we need to sign the board minutes or the committee minutes? And they don't. It's often helpful. And it's often helpful as a process of circulating board minutes and committee minutes right after a meeting?
Definitely. I think that the thing is, if you meet just 2 or 3 times a year in particular, the length of time between meetings can get long. And
Exactly.
if you make a practice of getting the minutes out to the meeting participants, say within 2 weeks or at most a month, then people can remember what actually transpired at the meeting. And if they have revisions to make, they can do that. And then, between that window of time of circulating the minutes, commenting on the minutes, then you can vote whenever the meeting actually is. But it's best not to just include your draft minutes with the next board book, because that could be 6 months after the meeting.
That's right. At the subsequent board meeting, you want to include the final minutes that everybody has approved, and you just have a simple approval of the final minutes at the subsequent meeting.
Right. And it's not to say that you can't make changes at that point. You could, but that people have an opportunity before the next meeting to really weigh in and make corrections.
Right. When it's fresh in everyone's minds.
Exactly.
And then the last question that comes up is, can we record board minutes and committee meetings and board meetings? And we generally recommend against recording and audio recording meetings. It's legally permissible as long as you can get the consent of everyone involved. But it's not really a best practice, other than, for example, I'm curious, Karen, your thought about recording oral histories of a foundation.
Sure. I mean, I think that's great. If that happens as part of a meeting, that's wonderful, to video or to audio tape. Even letters, if people feel more comfortable with that, it's really good to set down some of that history for subsequent generations. And in part, for the clarity that you were talking about earlier, to let people know what the founders or what the senior generation at any moment in time has in their minds.
Right. And so board minutes and committee minutes are really more than just a chore. They're an important legal document. They're an important communication tool. And if you force yourself to write them, it really forces yourself to think about them and to think about the governance and the management implications that they have for the foundation as well.
Right. And so I want to elaborate a little bit on that, is why they are important in terms of communications as well. We were talking about sending around the draft minutes. Well, what the draft minutes can do is allow people the opportunity to say, wait a minute, that's not what we said at the meeting. This is, the way the given person who is doing the minutes, they might have an interpretation that's just, not quite on point. And so this allows the group to say, this is what we meant, this is what we decided. And the idea really is when you comment on the minutes is not that it's revisionist history, like, oh, what I wish we had said was XYZ, but really clarity. That's what you're looking for. Clarity and accountability. It's very important in meetings also, and this is just a way to think about your meetings. Your minutes help you think about structuring your meetings. Oftentimes decisions get made and there is no next step assignment. And what can be helpful, if you always have in mind, like, what do we want to convey in the minutes? Well, what you want to convey is not only what we decided, but what's going to happen next and who owns it. So, if we come out of this meeting and we say, well, Andras is the one who is going to follow up on the legal question, and he's going to do that by May the 22nd. So that's an important piece as well, to give the accountability in the minutes.
So is an agenda important for a board meeting and a committee meeting?
An agenda can be just so key, like really, really framing what's happening. I think one of the best things that can happen is that the agenda has the strategic decision that needs to be made, the corresponding action that the board needs to take. So, for example, it might say, adopt or revise the conflict of interest policy. So the board knows before they even get to the meeting, this is what we are doing. And as part of that, they also know, the person who plans the meeting, whether that's the chair, whether it's staff, if you have staff, they also know what the questions are to consider when making that decision. So you might have, here's the action, revise or adopt a conflict of interest policy, and this is what we need to consider. We need to consider, is it okay to serve on a grantee board or not? Recusal from discussions, recusal from votes. What would the elements be? And that should all be lined up before the meeting so that you hit the right questions, you are able to make a decision rather than table the discussion. Those are all parts of it. And that, of course, makes writing the minutes flow a lot easier. So it's a continuum. You start as a governance matter, you start with a well-framed agenda. What's the question we're trying to answer? What's the strategic question? What do we need to consider to answer that question? And then you have the discussion and the material to back up that discussion before the meeting. So that'll make minutes a piece of cake.
That's great. How about confidentiality? I know that there's a lot of foundations and organizations and nonprofits that struggle with the level of detail that needs to be included or should be included in a board minutes or committee minutes.
Right.
What are your experiences with that and opinions about that?
Well, I am a believer that what the minutes should reflect are really issues, not people. And in other words, if you are very specific about who said what, who asked what question, it can lead to people feeling uncomfortable asking questions. So for example, let's say the board was considering where to lease space, and they're talking about one of the criteria you might want to consider is who's the landlord and what the landlord's reputation is. That would be a very reasonable thing to consider. And you might not want it to say, Andras reflected on the Donaldson Management Company and the Smith Management Company, and he feels that Smith runs a shady operation. If you feel that the minutes are going to be specific to what you said and what you said about others and maybe about grantees or vendors, you might not want to share your concerns. So in minutes, it's best to flag the issues. For example, to say, the board considered the reputation of the landlords, and the board considered the price point, the various factors that were considered, and the rationale for making the decision. Set all that down, but don't name names.
What else do you think minutes should have from a governance and management perspective? What are your marvelous minutes?
Well, as we talked about, a well-framed agenda certainly contributes to marvelous minutes. But we also touched on the fact that it provides context years down the line. What you want to be able to know is to refer back and to have enough information about a decision to know why it was made. And sometimes that has to do with like family members, that has to do with grant making, because donor intent is a really good example. If you don't provide information about why people want to make grants in a certain focus area, why certain decisions were made, like for example, about the size of grants, about grant making vehicles. Are we going to do capital grants? Mm-hmm. Are we going to do endowment grants? And why? What was the thinking that underlay that? Without that, subsequent generations have a really hard time understanding, was this just they didn't do capital grants because that wasn't their practice, they never did, or was there some philosophical reason behind it, that the older generation thought services were more important? To know the rationale, minutes are just critical. And if you don't lay out those things in minutes, people will try to guess. There's always that historian in later generations who, if you haven't set out your intent, will try to derive it.
And everyone's perspectives is always different with respect to history and what happened in the past.
Right, and I have another good example about that. There's a foundation, the Clemens Foundation, and I can cite them by name because this example was in the press in the early 2000s. And the Clemens made their fortune in the timber industry, and they set out a very specific mission that you would think would be clear enough for generations to come forever. Their mission was to educate the children of timber workers. And that had to do with supporting their community and tied to their industry, the timber industry. But lo and behold, 50, 60 years after the foundation was formed and after the founders had passed away, the timber industry was really not much of a player anymore in their Oregon community. And people were actually moving to the community to get their children's education paid for. And they had nothing to do with the timber industry. And it became quite a conflict in the community because really, when you think about it, that mission, although it seems straightforward, you could look at it like, if I talk about it, emphasize differently, was the mission to educate the children of timber workers, or was it to educate the children of timber workers? What's significant? Was it education? Was it children? Was it timber workers? And actually, there was a lot of disagreement about that by their nephews, by the person who was school board chair at the time the foundation was set up. So even if that seems clear, if their minutes had reflected exactly what was important to them, it would have avoided a lot of conflict in the community. And if you're interested in learning more about that, someone from their community, which is Philomath or Oregon, actually a recipient of one of their scholarships, made a documentary about this situation, which is pretty interesting. And it's called Clear Cut, the story of Philomath, Oregon. So
circumstances can really change. I think that's a great example with respect to donor intent.
Right.
So before we talk for a minute about how to keep minutes and recording and storing minutes, I wanted to ask you about executive sessions. That is another question that comes up. What is your thoughts on how to record executive sessions?
Well, executive sessions are another example where confidentiality is really important to have a free flowing discussion. And what we mean by an executive session is a session where, if it is a staffed foundation, where the staff leaves the room to allow the board to have a discussion. And the contexts where you might want to use that would be evaluation of the staff member. Compensation would be another one.
We have it come up in the audit context, for example, where we have an auditor do a presentation for a committee, the audit committee, with staff involved. And then at the end of the meeting, right before a wrap up, you typically have the staff leave the discussion and just have an executive session of the audit committee where the auditors can give some thoughts about what this year's audit looked like.
And if they have concerns, I guess, with internal controls or other matters, they can present them without the staff being defensive.
Exactly. And a lot of the discussion there focuses on, hey, how was it to work with the staff during this audit cycle?
Okay.
And it's really important. That gives you a sense as, was the staff reluctant in certain points? Were they very helpful? So it's a way to have a frank discussion, as you say, without staff being present.
Right. The important thing in terms of your minutes is once you've had this executive session, sometimes they're just to allow this frank conversation, but sometimes decisions are made in executive session. And if that is the case, then the decision itself does need to be in the minutes, even though in this case you don't necessarily need the specifics and the rationale, because it may be that it's truly confidential, but you do need to record the decision.
Do you like to have regular executive sessions, or we sometimes have staff that are very concerned when all of a sudden, unexpectedly, an executive session is called?
Right, right. And that is understandable, because sometimes executive sessions, maybe there's never been one in 5 years, and suddenly there's an executive session, and then the staff member is going to be nervous. What does this mean? Are they unhappy with me? So yeah, I think that executive sessions on a scheduled basis can be helpful to ratchet down the nerves. For example, at one of the foundations where I worked, there was a brief executive session after every meeting, and sometimes it would last 2 minutes, sometimes it would last 10, sometimes it would be a half an hour, but I knew there was always going to be one. And so it didn't make me think, oh my God, what's the matter? So you may not want one at every meeting, but you may want one once a year or twice a year as a regular course of action.
That's great. Well, this has been a great conversation for me. I've learned certainly a lot about the governance and management tools for board minutes and committee minutes. So I'm interested to hear a couple of your tips and insights about the practical way of sharing minutes and keeping minutes for posterity.
Right.
And how do you safekeep them?
Well, I think now, certainly, and I'd like to know if you would agree, I think that minutes, unlike, say, checkbooks or something, I think minutes should be kept forever.
I agree. From a legal perspective, as a legal document, keep them forever. That's exactly right.
I mean, they're just such a good historical record, and as I said, we had occasion to use them 30 years later in a legal case. So for many reasons, I think they're just such a key historical document that I'd keep them. And certainly for foundations that have been around for a long time, that probably means notebooks in the office.
That's right.
Which, maybe you'd want to scan at this point. But what a lot of foundations are doing now is posting to the cloud so that the minutes are accessible to any board member or perhaps even any family member through a piece of the website that is password protected And then those folks, anybody who needs to see anything at any time, can have a look.
It's almost like your articles and bylaws. Your minutes are really a fundamental organizing document
That's right.
that you'd really do want your board members to have access to.
Yeah, and also I think when you do board orientation, for example, you would obviously want the founding documents to be part of the orientation material. And maybe the last couple meeting minutes or the last year or last 2 years, and certainly in my work as a consultant to foundations, and I'm sure you as an attorney, I frequently ask for recent minutes.
Yes.
Just to get a flavor of how the foundation does business and that sort of thing.
Yes, and it's very revealing that you can, from the board minutes and committee minutes, you can immediately get a sense as to how a foundation is managed and governed.
Right.
And just by looking at their minutes.
Absolutely.